So we're looking at today what's called incidence of taxation, and that has to do with who is paying the lion's share of their portion of taxes when a tax is imposed. So indirect taxes. So first of all, we need to give a definition of what an indirect tax is, and basically the definition is that indirect taxes are levied or imposed on spending to buy goods and services. So this is the definition. Another way of looking at it simply is a tax on goods and services. It's called indirect because it doesn't go directly from the consumer to the government. So if you buy something at a store, you pay the retailer the amount of whatever the good is, and then in Canada we pay the 13% HST. The store collects the amount for whatever is sold plus the tax. Then at the end of the month, they file a report with the government and say how much tax they've collected overall for the month, and then ship off a check to the government for that tax. So the mechanism is that it's not going directly from you to the government, but through an intermediary, but that is not the definition. That is the mechanism of how it works. Examples are excise taxes, which are taxes on special products with a special rate of tax. So you'll see that if you fill up your tank of gas for your car, it's on the pump itself will say what all the different taxes are. Or it could be things like taxes on cigarettes. It could be general sales taxes, such as I mentioned, our HST of 13%. Or if you're in Britain, the VAT tax, a value-added tax. Indirect taxes can be a flat tax, known also as a specific tax, involved as an absolute amount, such as $2 per pack of cigarettes, no matter how much the cigarettes cost. The other kind is an ad valorem tax, which is simply a percentage tax. In this case, the amount of the tax increases as the price of the good or service increases. So let's say you've got 10% tax, which is 10% on all of the different goods and services. If you're buying something for $10, the tax would be $1. But if you're buying something for $100, the tax would be $10. So the amount of tax increases as the price increases. Excuse me. An indirect tax is one imposed upon expenditure. It's placed on the selling price of the product, so it's going to look like it's going on the supply curve. So it raises the firm's costs and shifts the supply curve for the product vertically upwards. So we're not going to say to the left or to the right anymore. In the case of a tax, it's going up. In the case of the subsidy, it went down by the amount of the subsidy. Because of this shift, less product will be supplied at every price. So this is an example of a specific tax. So no matter what the price is, it's still $1 for each unit sold. An ad valorem tax, let's say we were to look at, for example, 10%. If the good were $10, then the tax would be $1. But if the good were $50, then the tax would be $5. So the supply curve with the tax opens vertically upwards because it keeps increasing as the price is increasing. So let's look at the effect of a tax when a tax is placed on the supplier. So we're going to draw a parallel. Remember, I don't have a ruler, you do. We're going to shift it up by the amount of the tax. So let's say that was $1 or $10, and then we'd say S with tax. What you then want to do is look at the new equilibrium, not the old. So I'm going to put down a larger blob at the new equilibrium, and I want to create a rectangular box, just like I did with a subsidy. And it needs to go between the two supply curves. Another way of looking at it is if I were to go upwards, I'm not going to hit anything. So I'm not going to be able to create a rectangle. So I'm going to bring this down, I'm going to bring this over, and I'm going to bring this over. Now, from the equilibrium price, it makes sense that the consumer is going to pay a higher price. And it makes sense now that the producer is going to receive a lower price. We bring this down, we can see that quantity has decreased. And all of this is the tax revenue. Now, you might ask, If the consumer is paying more, why does the supplier have to receive less? An example I'd like to think of is, let's say I was selling my house for $1 million, and they've imposed a new realty tax or land transfer tax on the sale of my house of, of whatever percentage. The house that I originally was selling for $1 million, it's not going to sell for $1 million anymore because the consumer is going to have to pay a higher price due to the tax. So I'm going to now need to drop my price a bit from the $1 million in order to incentivize or to have the sale happen where someone is going to want to buy my house with this additional tax. So what ends up happening with the imposition of a tax is that the producers receive a lower price and the consumers have to pay a higher price, and both parties are indeed affected. So let's look at the producer revenue with an indirect tax. So producer revenue before tax. So if I call this 0 or O, and I call this QE, I'll call this A, and I'll call this PE, it would be the box O, QE, A, PE. Then once I've imposed a tax, so raising this by the amount of the tax, this is S with tax. I draw the tax box. Price consumers pay, price producers receive. This becomes Q2, and I'll call this point C. So producer revenue after tax is this much smaller box, O, Q2, C, PP. So it's decreased to this box that I've just outlined right now. Let's look at the government tax revenue with an indirect tax. We did look at that at another slide, but let's just draw it one more time. We're going to have lots of practice drawing tax graphs. So here's the tax. Here's S with tax. And again, here's my new point of equilibrium. Here's my rectangular box. Price consumers pay, price producers receive, and here is all the tax revenue. So let's look at the tax burden of an indirect tax. So right now it looks like the supply and demand curve have the same slope. That's going to change once we look at one party being more price inelastic than the other. But let's look at just simply what a tax burden means. So let's impose the tax. Here's the tax, S with tax. Let's create that rectangular box. Price producers receive, price consumers pay. So this top one here is the consumer tax burden. And the one below will be the producer tax burden. Let's look at the loss of consumer and producer surplus. So just a reminder, consumer surplus, we have people who are willing and able to buy at a higher price, but lo and behold, they get the equilibrium price, so that entire triangle is the consumer surplus. We have producers who are willing and able to sell at a lower price, but again, they got the equilibrium price, so this lower triangle is all the producer surplus. Let's see what happens once a tax is imposed. So here's the tax, S with tax, and So here's our new point of equilibrium. Bring this across. Price that consumers pay, price that producers receive. Now, we're not going to shade in the tax revenue as being part of the loss of producer and consumer surplus. But we can see that the consumer surplus is much smaller now. The producer surplus is much smaller as well. So just a moment here. There. And then in terms of the deadweight loss, this will be on another video, but it ends up being this area here. It's what we call deadweight loss. Or DWL. So the incidence of taxation. This refers to the burden of a tax or those who are the ultimate payers of the tax. So let's impose a tax again, and we are looking where demand is relatively inelastic. So we're putting the tax here, S with tax. Looking at the new box, bringing it down and across. Price that producers receive, price that consumers pay. Who pays more tax? We can see that the consumers have a much larger increase than the loss that the producers have, so it's the consumers. So let's look at when supply is relatively inelastic. Now I'm just going to warn you, don't shift the supply curve up by much, or don't make it look like it's shifting to the left too much, because otherwise your lines won't line up. So here's the tax, S with tax. Here's our new point of equilibrium. Bring this down to the other supply curve. Bring this across. Price producers receive, price consumers pay, and we can see by far it's the producers that pay more tax, so they have the larger burden of taxation. So conclusion from your finding, so the more price inelastic party has the larger burden of taxation. So what determines who will pay the more tax? Elasticity of demand, or sorry, I should say price. Elasticity of demand and supply. Okay, the size of the government's tax revenues. If we have something that has a relatively inelastic demand and supply curve, and we put a tax on it, S with tax, we're going to see that the tax burden is relatively large, or the tax revenue, pardon me. Tax revenue is significant. Let's put it on something that's relatively elastic. So S with tax. Now I shouldn't have had the equilibrium so far to the right of the y-axis because it's a little bit harder to see, but we tend to see that the tax revenue is smaller. Okay, so paper 3, quantitative analysis. This is HL only. So if you're not HL at this point, you can stop the PowerPoint and go on to look at the next one that has to do with deadweight loss. Okay, so let's say we've got two demand and supply functions. So if we look at, and this is going to be a little tricky on me because I can't use a ruler with the tablet. It will not allow me to do that. But if I'm looking at what the quantity demanded is, and I'm doing some of the math behind here, and 2,000 minus 400, so we've got 1,600. We can see that it's going down by 200 each time, so I'm just going to carry the same pattern downwards. And then I'm just going to double check that I haven't made any mistakes and do the last thing with the math. So 200 times 6 would be 1,200, leaving us with 800. Yes, our pattern does hold. I'm going to do the same thing with supply. I'm going to see that this is minus 400 plus 800. So the pattern is holding. I'm going to continue the pattern. And then I'm going to check my math on the last one to make sure I haven't made any mistakes. No, the pattern holds. Okay, so on the next slide, it's going to be identify the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Well, we can see at 1,200 that the quantities are the same, and there is the price. So equilibrium quantity bought and sold, so P equals $4 and Q equals 1,200. We are going to graph the supply and demand function and put the tax on this graph. In order to graph the supply and demand function, we're going to take some points from the table that we initially drew or created. So if we look at the demand function, we know that one of the points that we can graph is the point looking at, price of 0. We have a quantity of 2,000, so I'll put down, make that blue, put down that spot there. And then we know another point, we want to take it significantly far away so that we'll have a greater sense of accuracy. We know that at $6, we're going to have a quantity demanded at 800. So we'll go over 5, 6, 7, 8, and go up to 6, and put down a spot. So we are at 6, and we are at 800. We're going to connect the two. I'm going to try using a ruler. Hopefully it won't mess up on the tablet that we're doing. So from 2000 onwards. So here is our demand function. So now let's take supply. We know supply at a price of 1 gave us a quantity supplied of 0, so I'll put down a dot there. And we know at a price of 6, we were demanding, supplying 2,000. So we'll put down a dot there. We will connect the two. And that is our supply curve. We're going to check the point of intersection, see if we made a mistake, and it is sitting at $1,204. And if we look at our table, again, the equilibrium quantity and price was $4 and 1,200. Since we want to impose a tax of $1.50, we're going to shift the supply curve up by 3 boxes because each box represents 50 cents. We're going to take 2 extreme points to do that, so I might as well use the beginning point and the end point since they fit nicely on the grid, and shift that up by 3 points. I'll take the initial point where it meets the y-axis and shift it up by 3 points. I'm going to connect those 2 dots. We've shifted it upwards by the amount of the tax. We're going to call this S with tax. I'm going to look at the initial equilibrium because I'm going to need that point for some future calculations. Bring that over and call that the old PE. I'm going to look at the new point of equilibrium, give it a nice blob or circle, and I'm going to create the tax revenue box, bringing it down between the two supply curves. Bring that across. And at the top, I'm going to bring that across as well. Now we know that the price that consumers pay is more than the old equilibrium, so we'll call the top one PC. And we know that producers are now going to receive a lower price, so I'll call that lower price PP. The PP is $3.50, and the price that consumers pay is now $5. And hence the difference between the two is the amount of the tax, which is $1.50. All right, you're asked to calculate a couple of things on the following slides. So we're asked to calculate the government revenue from the tax. So that's going to be the full amount of the tax, the $1.50, times the new quantity being 1,000 units. So it will be $1.50 times 1,000 equaling 1,500. You're going to ask to calculate the tax paid by the consumers. So we see from the equilibrium point to the point that the consumers pay is $1, and $1 times 1,000 units sold is $1,000. And the amount that the producers pay, we see from the equilibrium dropping down to the price that the producers now receive is 50 cents. So 50 cents times 1,000 would be 500. You're also asked to calculate the area of the loss of, or illustrate, the area showing the loss of consumer and producer surplus. I'm going to call that deadweight loss. It is, we know that the, anyway, I'll shade that in here, and we're going to look at that in much more detail in a future PowerPoint. So I'm going to call that DWL for deadweight loss. And it's considered the loss of producer and consumer surplus. Note that I didn't shade in the tax revenue box as being part of the loss of the consumer or producer to surplus because it's considered to be used in some useful way in society or the economy, so I'm not going to call it a loss. So I'll just show. So we looked at this previously, but I'll put it down in numbers here. We're asked, number one, to calculate the government revenue from the tax. So we know that the amount of tax is $1.50. We know that the new quantity sold is 1,000 units. And so the overall total revenue will end up being $1,500. Now that's split into two components. There's going to be the amount that the consumers pay and the producers. So as previously pointed out, the consumers used to pay a price of the equilibrium used to be $4. They're now paying $5. So their burden is $1 for each unit sold. The total number of units sold is 1,000. So their tax burden is $1,000. In terms of the producers, they used to receive $4 per unit. Now they receive $3.50. So they have a 50-cent burden for each unit times 1,000 units equaling 500. So note, it makes sense that the sum of the consumer burden plus the producer burden is going to equal the total amount of the tax revenue that has been raised. I showed the area of consumer and producer surplus, showing the loss of producer and consumer surplus, which is like the deadweight loss, and PED is more inelastic. Thank you.